So, hey, welcome to TRF Tuesday, our weekly mini workshop series from a variety of bright voices in therapeutic embodiment. If you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. It's the best way to let YouTube know that you think this content is valuable and to show it to more people. This week's host is the wonderful Mariah Rooney. Mariah is a social justice and collective liberation oriented, queer identifying, incredibly curious and passionate trauma therapist and embodiment practitioner. Her clinical experience includes work with children, adolescents, and adults in outpatient, community, hospital, and specialty care settings. Mariah's approach to treatment is integrative and draws from intersectional, anti-oppressive, anti-racist, contemporary relational, feminist, trauma-informed, and body-centric lenses. As an embodiment practitioner, they have taught trauma-sensitive yoga, meditation, and other movement practices to folks who are incarcerated, active duty military, and veterans, individuals in recovery, and adolescents and adults who have experienced trauma. Additionally, Mariah is a faculty member in the Graduate School of Social Work at Winona State University, a trauma-informed care consultant for the American Institutes of Research, is the co-founder and the co-director of Trauma-Informed Weightlifting, and was previously a fellow at the Trauma Center at the Social Resource Institute. We are here with Mariah for a series called On the Other Side of This or That, Breathing, Moving, and Knowing into a More Expansive Being. Welcome, Mariah. Thank you. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. And welcome, everyone. Some of you, I see some familiar names from the last few weeks and some new ones. It's really fun to be here with you all. If you got the notes from last week or from the email, you may have noticed that there was an invitation to have some paper as well as something to color with, like colored pencils or markers, anything at all. But also, that's okay if you don't have those things. If you do have even just a pen or a pencil or a couple of things to write with and some paper that you might be able to use, please take a couple of minutes to go ahead and grab that. The other thing is if you're able to set up at a table where you can move around a little bit, that's also ideal. Again, it's totally okay if this isn't accessible to you in this moment. No worries, we can make just about anything work. So there are plenty of options, but I'll say that now so that as I offer a little introduction, you can take some time to get set up or to grab things if you'd like to. We've really been exploring these last few weeks of the many ways in which we internalize in our bodies and our feelings, in our thoughts and beliefs, these what we call binary constructs. So that's what we're talking about when we say that this or that. It's really the kind of black and white ways that we see ourselves and see the world. And our culture has so much of that embedded in it. We're asked to try to organize and make sense out of our experience and our identities and all of these things all the time by putting labels or stamps on them. And sometimes when we grow up in cultures of origin or families of origin that have a little more rigid thinking, or perhaps we grew up in environments that are harmful or abusive, we may be told that we can and cannot be certain things, or we can and cannot feel or express certain things. And so that even there will really force us to kind of fragment ourselves, to take parts of us and put it over here, hide it away and protect it. And then other parts of us have to develop to make us kind of safe and welcome and hopefully belonging in that space when other parts of us aren't so welcome or don't belong in that space. And so, one of the many ways that we internalize these binary constructs is by developing these parts of ourselves that hold on to certain identities or certain aspects of our identity, that hold on to certain emotions or different protective or adaptive strategies that we might have. Our inner landscape is incredibly complex and it's nuanced, as it should be. It needs to be. That's how we adapt. That's how we survive. It's how we cope. And as I mentioned, as we grow in our cultures and families of origin, we take in so many different messages. Sometimes those messages are confusing or even conflicting about how we're expected to be, how we're expected to think, what we're expected to believe. And as we get to know our own internal landscapes, we may notice that some parts of us are seemingly at odds with one another. Or they appear almost to be in opposition to one another, really directly opposing. And this is some of what we've explored the last few weeks using a yoga nidra practice, how we experience some of those opposites. And today what we're going to do is we're going to take some of that internal experience and we're going to get it outside of us onto paper using some expressive art. And so, what we may encounter, or we may not even be aware that we do this quite often, is say things like, well, a part of me, feels this way. And another part of me feels this way, or a part of me wants this, and a part of me wants this other thing, right? You may think about times that you've even said that yourself or heard other people say that. And what we're saying in those moments is that I have different parts of me, and sometimes they don't want or need the same thing, or they don't move through the world in the same way. That's what allows us to adapt and to survive. And so just know that we're drawing out these really commonly held experiences of experiencing incongruence internally. And so today we're going to explore that. How can we expand into a larger awareness of who we are and the many identities that we hold, using some creativity? The other thing that I love about doing things like this is that it allows us to move out of the left brain and into the right brain, a space, a part of our brain that is more abstract, it's more visual and creative. And also, and this is coming from someone who is not a self-proclaimed artist in any way. Even when I work with small kids in therapy, they're sometimes confused by my drawings, and that's okay. So what I'll say is that whatever we create today is great. You don't have to create a masterpiece. We're not here to create anything that you have to feel, so proud of that you want to frame it and put it on the wall. This is really about the experience and the process. So we will also in this process be able to externalize these things. We get it out of that kind of swirl and spin that can happen internally, and we'll give it a home. We'll give it a place outside of ourselves. So that being said, I am going to invite you to go ahead and take, so ideally you would have 5 different pieces of paper. That's okay if you don't. You can also flip-flop papers, but at a minimum have 2 or have 1 sheet of paper that has 2 sides, or you can even, rip or cut something up, whatever works for you, and have whatever writing or drawing utensils that you have available to you nearby. And if you have the space with where you're sitting, what I'll invite you to do is, even if there's maybe 2 different places you can sit, even if it's just 1 chair or something that you're sitting on that you can move to different places, that works. If you have different chairs, you can move from 1 chair to another as we do some of these transitions and shifts, but that's absolutely not a requirement. So again, all just options. So what I'll do is have us just take a moment to kind of ground and land together first. And so I'll invite you to take a moment, wherever it is that you're sitting. If it feels right, you can close your eyes. If not, maybe let your gaze kind of land on something pleasant or neutral. And I'll have you just take a moment to notice the surface that you're sitting on, to notice how your breath is moving in your body in this moment without needing to change anything, just simply noticing. To notice anything that you might be carrying with you in terms of sensation in this moment, maybe something that's asking for your attention, or that becomes apparent as you start to settle and get a little quieter. And then we'll take a moment to begin to explore a couple of parts of us. So what I'll pose to you as a question or as a curiosity are, what are maybe 2 parts of you that are seemingly at odds with one another, maybe that want different things, or that express themselves or present themselves in maybe different ways in the world or in different relationships. Sometimes we can find these parts of ourselves by exploring areas where we're experiencing some indecisiveness. Or as I mentioned, we notice that maybe we behave in ways that are inconsistent or even opposite, perhaps. Thinking about ways or spaces or relationships where we perhaps hide or mask certain parts of your identity. So as we're landing and connecting in together, just taking a moment to, without having to engage with either part in this particular moment, simply allowing your awareness to kind of hold both of these parts, if you will, to notice that they're there. And if you find that that's a hard thing to do, that's okay too. It doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It's just simply, it could just be a new concept to you. And when we are introduced to new things, it can be really hard to figure these things out. So you may even just think of, I'm kind of this person when I go to work, or I'm this person when I'm at home, or, I'm wanting to make a decision and I notice that I feel drawn in this direction. And then there's another thing that's kind of drawing me in this other direction. That could be a clue into some of these parts. And you may just start there. Okay. So if your eyes are closed, go ahead and blink them open. And I'll have you grab your first sheet of paper. So you're going to grab paper and whatever it is that you're coloring or writing or drawing with. And I'll have you settle into a seat or into a position at the table or whatever you'll be writing or coloring on. And we're going to start with the part of you that feels more present or prominent in this scenario that we just explored. You don't have to do anything quite yet. So just taking a moment to allow this part to fully emerge and to be fully present. Noticing how it feels to deeply connect with this part of yourself, what shows up in your body, perhaps. Really connecting in with this part of you. And then whenever you would like, whenever you feel ready, allow this part to express itself on the paper in front of you. So again, no right or wrong way to do this. Whatever wants to find itself, its way out of you and onto the paper is totally fine. You may draw, scribble, doodle, use shapes or symbols. Could be a picture of something that you draw, maybe just words, phrases, texture, color, anything at all. But as you connect in with this part, we'll take a couple of minutes now to just allow you to see what shows up. So I'll be quiet now for a couple of minutes and give you some time to do that. If you're running into any challenges or you have any questions, you can feel free to send a message to me in the chat. Be happy to offer support or any additional guidance that might be helpful. We'll take just a little bit more time here with this part. No rush. It's okay if you don't get everything out or if you've already gotten enough out. That's just fine as well. And if you need more time here, take it. That's okay. You can listen in the background to the next instructions and you can shift into the next step whenever you're ready. No rush at all. And if you feel ready, you can let this drawing, this piece of paper that's in front of you be for now. And if you are in a place where you can shift to a different seat at the same table, I'd invite you to go ahead and do that. And if that's not available to you, no worries. What you can do is maybe even just shift the angle of where you're sitting, shift the angle of your chair, or shift it over a little bit, move it to another side of the table or wherever you're sitting, but just somehow identify a shift or a movement in your body, taking a different position. And then once you have a chance to do that, go ahead and grab another sheet of paper. So I'll have you set aside the first piece of paper where you were sitting originally. And then you'll take out another piece of paper and put it in front of you. And I'll have you just allow yourself to take a few kind of cleansing breaths. You're taking full inhales and exhales. And it's not that we're, setting aside or ignoring this part that we just connected with, but rather we're taking a little space, connecting with a different part of you now. So now we're shifting to a place that will allow you to connect with this other part that we identified initially. Okay. And if that doesn't feel right anymore, or if there's a need to still kind of figure out what that is, and you may think about what is perhaps the opposite of how you feel sometimes than the part that you just connected with. Or again, that kind of incongruence or internal conflict that we can experience at times. So in the this or that we've been working with, this is the that, if you will. And then take a minute to allow this other part to become fully present, to allow yourself to connect with it. Noticing now how this feels. How does this show up in your body, perhaps? What is it that feels different? Do things look different? And then when you're ready, I'll invite you again to use the paper in front of you to take what is inside and bring it outside, and to let this part express itself on the paper in front of you. Shapes, colors, textures, words, phrases, drawing, symbols, anything at all that wants to find its way out onto the paper. Giving it some space. And again, I'll pause for just a couple of minutes to let you have some time to do some of this exploration and expression. Take about another minute here with this part. And again, just because I offer a prompt for the next step doesn't mean that you have to be done with this step. Take the time that you need or want here. And if you're done, that's okay. So what I'll invite you to do now, if you're in a space where you can kind of stand and shake out your body, maybe shake out your hands, shake out your arms, or stand up and move or wiggle to kind of let some of this energy move through your body. And then if it's an option with where you're sitting, with the table that you have set up, these other 3 sheets of paper, you'll take one and put it in between these 2 drawings that you have so far. And then you'll take the other 2 and put them on either side of the ends, right? So we've got kind of 5 sheets of paper. And then if you can, take your seat and find a seat that's in between these 2 parts, in front of the blank piece of paper that is now in the middle of these 2 drawings on the table in front of you, on the surface in front of you. And I'll pose a slightly different question. And what happens when you sit with the space between these 2 parts, right? Because part of what we're exploring is how we experience this kind of inner conflict or incongruence when we feel really forced to be this or that, or to show up in this or that way, or to live out our identities in these really binary ways, right? And it kind of forces us into this internal conflict. So what we're going to do is explore what might exist in the space between these parts. And it may take a little imagination. You may even notice that that's really hard to even imagine. It may seem impossible, and it may be that these parts just kind of show up and take over, and you may not even be able to connect with what else there could be. And that's okay. That's also a thing to notice in this process is, what's that about? Where does that come from? And then at the same time, you have these other sheets of paper on either end, and you may notice, what is it that's just beyond that part on this side? What is it that's just beyond this other part on the other side? And if you find yourself as you're exploring the space in between thinking, oh, well, this isn't quite in between, it's kind of past this part or beyond that part, or it's past this part or beyond that part, then you may use those papers to draw, to sketch, to write, to doodle, to color. And I'll give you again just another minute or so to explore the spaces between and the spaces beyond these parts of you. And just notice what comes up. And we'll just take about another minute or so. All right. Yeah, just because I'm moving to the next step doesn't mean you have to. If you're ready, what I'll invite you to do now is to kind of almost shift your seat back a little bit. So you're literally going to change your perspective or the viewpoint that you have of everything that's out in front of you right now. You may wish to stand up and look, or scoot your chair back, or move from side to side. But give yourself a moment to look at everything that is now lying out in front of you about how these parts have expressed themselves, found their way out of your internal experience and onto these papers. And see what happens. Tuning in with your body and noticing what is it that happens as you see this inner world out in front of you. Things that feel like opposites or incongruents or parts of us that seem at odds with one another. What happens when you zoom out a little bit and take it all in, and also noticing the space in between and the spaces beyond? And take your time doing that. I do want to take a few moments. I know we have some space for Q&A, but also just to share if are there any reflections? Are there things that you notice that come up for you that you can bring into the chat? Anything about the experience that stands out to you that feels curious, or takeaways that you have from this experience for yourself? See, one is stronger than the other, but I don't want it to be. Interesting. Yeah. 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 So sometimes we often have in these scenarios, one part is more dominant or more prominent. And that's typically the one that has had to be that way. Again, within whatever setting or environment we're in, perhaps that's the one that is the most accepted or the most celebrated or the one that's the safest in that space or in that relationship. And we may notice then that, there's this other part of me that I want to take up more space, that I want to be more known or more present in my life, to share with the world more. So I wonder if that's part of what you might be sharing. Helena, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Thank you for sharing that. And nice job of sticking with it. That's not an easy thing to do when you notice that parts want to shut down or pull away. Sometimes I think what can happen too, and I'm not sure if this is your experience, is that when parts of us that notice, oh, you know what, you're going to ask me to see other things here, they can sometimes feel a little threatened. Does that mean that I don't belong? Or does that mean that I don't have a place or that my role isn't as important? And so I appreciate that what you've shared there. It can be really helpful to just offer a reminder to ourselves that every part of us is welcome. They all exist for a reason. And that it can be hard to explore beyond these oppositions when that is just the way that we have existed or operated for so long. And to remind ourselves, it doesn't mean that there's some part of us that's not welcome. I hope that might be helpful. So Jeff says emotional parts get pushed out versus competent parts. Yeah. So often what happens, right? If there are certain, let's say anger is not a welcome emotion to express in a certain environment that we're in or in our families, we may develop parts to protect our anger from being expressed, so it shuts it down. Maybe the only thing that we can express is showing a part of us that's really smart, something like that, right? And maybe that's what you mean along the lines of competence, something along those lines. And then those emotions have to get pushed away. So that's a really wonderful observation, Jeff. Thank you. Great. Thanks, Bryant. Yeah, so highlights how much more binary this duality is. Yeah, to see it. There's something about seeing it, right? We have these experiences internally all the time. And sometimes, I'll talk to folks that can feel like you've got a pinball game or a ping pong game going on inside. Like things are just pinging around in reaction to one another. And that can feel really overwhelming. And so something like this can be a helpful process where we slow things down and we get it outside of us onto something in front of us, and can be really, really helpful. So you can do this too with journaling, right? You can journal from different parts to offer them space. Interesting. The middle drawing is so static and uniform. That is interesting. I have so much curiosity about that, Mary. Thank you for sharing. Pinball reference. Yeah. Yes, I like that one too, because it's a little, I like the ping pong one too, because it talks about that back and forth, but pinball is a little more chaotic. We're really reactive when we play pinball. We hit things quickly and kind of hope that we can keep things in the air, and things are bouncing around and setting other things off, and then that sets this other thing off. And I think we can experience our different parts of us in that way. This part reacts to that part, or to this part, or this one shows up to protect that one. And it can really feel like that when it's happening really quickly, or if it's happening unconsciously, or if we're dysregulated, for example, if we're having a tough time.
Different things light up and act different ways when the ball hits them.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad that landed for you, Helena. If there's other observations, anything's welcome at all.
Well, while we're waiting to see if anything comes up in the chat, I want to say that when I did the first drawing, I did not expect there to be the frenzy and anger that ended up showing up in it. I had no idea, and my drawing was full of sharp lines and sharp angles and overlap over and over. So it just looked like chaos on the page when I was done. It was such a surprise.
Yeah.
And then in contrast, the second was so orderly and neat. And I didn't know those aspects were there to these parts.
Yeah. It's so amazing. Well, and I'm just even curious, Mary, like even as you talked about the first drawing, the way you kind of like showed your hand holding, it's interesting even to watch yourself in the process, right? Like how we hold the writing or drawing utensil can also be telling how quickly we move or how slowly we move, if we're hesitant or forceful. It's all is so telling. There's an energy behind these things. So I appreciate that.
Oh, it's so true.
Yeah.
I definitely had different force with each one for sure.
Yeah.
We have two interesting questions here. Would you ever revisit the middle point, the middle part, and draw what you would like it to be?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, Mary, here's what I say to that. I certainly don't have a perfect answer for that, but part of this exercise is about exploring the ways that we internalize binary constructs, right? That kind of separation. And the middle point, the thing that's so curious is it doesn't always have to be a middle ground between those opposites. And that's also why I add the beyond part, because sometimes what happens is we forget that we are fluid and evolving, and that parts of us develop often very early on, and then they kind of stay reacting to the present moment based on the past, right? And so what we can do is kind of help them update their job description, help parts of us orient to the present, which hopefully, depending on a situation, looks different and looks more suitable for us. And that may allow us to kind of soften the edges around these things, and that these parts of us are always so necessary and welcome and important. And it may be that a desire to kind of evolve a part's job or how it shows up in our life, that there's more space for that. Or if we've had to hide a part of us, that we are allowing this other part of us to emerge more and to take up more space. That's really, really important. This is something that I do with a lot of LGBTQ clients that I work with who have been in spaces where aspects of their identity have not been welcome or safe in their communities or their families, and how they develop parts of them to hide their authentic true selves. And that what we do is we imagine that space in between and beyond. And sometimes it's a really hard thing to do, but for them, it is some of that, right? To think about how, like, what is important about how I show up in the world. And then also how do we can have such gratitude for the protective parts of us that have been more dominant, because they helped us in these situations that we're in. So I didn't totally answer your question probably, but I'm hoping that I at least spoke to it generally about kind of the thinking about the space between and the space beyond.
Another one I like here is, how important is it to identify the triggers that are shifting you from one state to another?
That's such a great question. I think it's wonderfully important because it gives us conscious awareness of the pinball game, right? Like it tells us when we hit the button on the side of the machine, why we're hitting it, right? So it's like one thing that I say to people is, as an example, this isn't true for everyone, but I think about how many folks are like, when I get around my family of origin, I suddenly feel like I'm like 12 or 14 all over again, or I've turned into this different version of myself that I never act like that in these other spaces in my adult life. What is going on, right? And so that in and of itself, you can say, oh, I'm curious about what is it that kind of poked at or triggered the shift in me into a different part. So it gives us an opportunity to explore that further, and then to figure out, what does that tell us about what we need in those scenarios, about what might be kind of tender or needing care or needing boundary or support. So hopefully that answers your question.
So there's another question here, but I feel like it sort of retreads a little bit of the one we just answered. So keeping up with the pinball metaphor, how can you soften the barriers between each of these areas? Like what's a good way to sort of like ease into that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting to me, that's a beautiful question, is that I often think that our bodies hold the truth, because our bodies are terrible at lying. Our bodies are terrible liars. They're just these like profound truth tellers. And that often it's our mind that develops really strong strategies to ignore our bodies, or to choose consciously or unconsciously to interpret signals or messages we're getting from our body differently. And even our emotions, right? It's often about the interpretation of our feelings that can distort things a little bit. So for me, it's often about getting to the truth that's held in our bodies. It's like, well, what when I think about doing this thing, how does that feel? If I think about doing this other thing, how does that feel? And then listening to some of that. And, we are not separate beings, right? Our minds, our hearts, and our bodies are inherently connected. And so there's a lot of truth in the combination of those things, but hopefully that speaks to some of what you're asking. Yeah,
there's one quote that really drove that home for me. I read a couple years ago. It's like saying, it's like a pilot saying, I'm flying, right? Like with ignoring the plane that's flying, like your mind is the pilot and your body is the plane. It's like, that's what it feels like.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I like that. I may have to steal that back.
Sure. Yeah. I stole it. Pass it along.
Thievery. Yeah.
I think that's probably where we should wrap up. Do you want to let people know what to expect for next week?
Sure. Yeah. So we're going to continue on with this exploration of binaries and the kind of this or that business that we've been diving into and exploring. And next week, we're going to do that through using our bodies and actually using our eyes and our what we call our orienting responses to explore this a little bit further. So I'm excited about being together for that again.